It's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. I'm Melinda Rabb. I'm a professor in the Department of English. My first introduction, of course, is the recently retired, to the dismay of many, National Public Radio correspondent Corey Flintoff. You all know his voice. You all know his voice and the familiar sign-off. I'm Corey Flintoff, but I can't say it the way he does. And now you can meet the man to whom that voice belongs. During almost 40 years as a radio journalist, beginning in Bethel, Alaska, population 6,000, 400 miles on the coast west of Anchorage, Corey has traveled the globe and reported on an astonishing list of major world events. The civil war in Libya, the downing of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17, the Olympic sports doping scandal, pirates in Somalia, earthquake in Haiti, Egypt during the Arab Spring, Russia's seizure of Crimea, the Ukrainian Revolution, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, where he was embedded with US troops. He spent 2 years in Delhi, and most recently 4 years in Moscow as NPR's bureau chief, reporting on the growing authoritarianism of Vladimir Putin's Russia. But I want to say a word, and this is directed at the students in the room, about why I get to have the privilege of introducing our guest. One of the most valuable aspects about studying at a university is the opportunity to meet a diverse group of people whose paths intersect because they share a class or a dorm, a team, a club, or some other serendipitous happenstance. You never know what will happen once you leave campus, but the future is full of surprises. Corey Flintoff and I took classes in English literature together and formed a friendship during our single year at the University of Chicago. Yes, he was an English major. And he shares the English major's love and respect for language and the belief that it should mean something. He can still cite passages from Gulliver's Travels, I discovered last night, and he is writing a novel. After the year in Chicago, he headed west for Alaska, and I east for Cambridge. But good friendships do not just go away. I wish you, all you students out there, similar bonds in your futures. It's something to look forward to. At a historical moment when we all have been reminded of the value of reliable information, what we at Brown call fact-based research subject to peer review, Corey's career has exemplified the possibility of trying to find the facts and to tell the truth as best one can. We're joined on stage tonight by 3 of my distinguished colleagues, representing the several departments that have collaborated in true Brown interdisciplinary style to co-sponsor this event. John Reedy is a lecturer in the English department and esteemed teacher of journalism and creative nonfiction, as well as 20th century and contemporary novels. He's edited the collection Crafting Cultural Rhetorics, Readings for University Writers, and published both critical and creative writing. Linda Cook is professor in the departments of political science and Slavic studies. Her books include The Soviet Social Contract and Why It Failed, Post-Communist Welfare States, Reform Politics in Russia and Eastern Europe. She recently was granted a Fulbright Scholarship for research in the Russian Federation for her current project, Political Economies of Healthcare in Russia's Fragmented Welfare State. And James Morone is John Hazen White Professor of Public Policy, Director of the Alfred Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy, and professor of political science and urban studies. He's written, so I actually wrote down that he wrote 10 books, but having just checked more recently, he's actually written 11. And over 150 articles, reviews, and essays on American political history, healthcare policy, and social issues. His first book, The Democratic Wish, was named a notable book by the New York Times. His Hellfire Nation, The Politics of Sin in American History, was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. His most recent is The Devils We Know, although I don't know, maybe there's even another one that's about to come out. I'm not really sure. But in any case, we have a wonderful group of speakers to listen to tonight, and I hope you will join me in welcoming them.
Well, thank you, Melinda, for that lovely introduction. We're about to turn it over to Corey Flintup, who you will now soon discover is more than a pretty voice. He's got a fascinating life. We want to get to Russia and Putin and Trump, as we've advertised. But first, we thought it would be fun to hear a little bit about his backstory. He had to know how to sign off in Alaska in 2 different languages, so you'll hear a variation of a sign-off in just a second. But first, to walk us through the pre-story of Corey's experiences abroad, we're going to turn to Jonathan to just see the pre-engineering of a reporter.
Yes, and we do have a lot of students in the audience, both undergrad and graduate, and we're very curious about your coming-of-age story. You know, high school, college, when you were 20 to 25 and you were plotting the next move. How did it start for you, and how did you get to the point where you became an investigative foreign correspondent?
Well, after I left the University of Chicago, where Melinda and I became friends, I decided that what I really wanted to be was a fiction writer. And that's because I took a class about Flannery O'Connor and was absolutely seduced by good short story writing. But you always are looking for that perfect place where you're gonna sit down and you're gonna write whatever your great American fiction may be. And it happened that my wife at the time was a dental student and had run up her student loans and needed to pay them off, and she did that by joining the Indian Health Service. And so that was an opportunity for me to go back to my home state of Alaska. And we wound up in a small town in southwestern Alaska on the Kuskokwim River. It's called Bethel. At that time, it had a population of around 4,000, and 90% of those people were Yupiks. They were Yupik Eskimos. And we first got there to the Public Health Service Hospital, and I asked one of the doctors there, well, what do you do for jobs around here? Where do you go? Because I thought, I could support myself during the long nights while writing whatever this great American novel was going to be. And he said, oh, go to the radio station. They always need something. So turned out, sure enough, they did. And the only thing you had to do at the station, which was bilingual, was to be able to say the station identification in Yupik. So I got somebody to coach me and walk me through this until I was able to say this. Ni chugni uchi ni chugni sutkun kewa ke makmani mam talechami. And I got the job. And as I was telling somebody just earlier that, one of the things that job taught me was respect for your listeners and readers, and respect for the culture of people who surround you. I made a lot of really awful mistakes when I was a young reporter in Bethel. One of my first jobs was to cover the local city council and the school board. And when I first went there, it was full of interesting characters, and they were just, loud and boisterous and argumentative and fractious. And I came home and I said, these people are buffoons. What am I doing spending my time covering their politics? But it didn't take very long to realize that, these are the people who were on the city council and the school board were the people who made things happen in this community, and they did it out of genuine allegiance to the better interests of their community as they saw it. And I came to have a lot of respect for them. And that actually is what got me hooked on journalism as opposed to fiction.
And how did you make it to NPR Central? Everyone knows that you're the voice of the 6 o'clock news.
Yeah, well,
How'd you get there?
as Dan Rather would tell you, every reporter who gets a bump up in their career usually has it because of some disaster or catastrophe. In my case, it was the Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989. That was, the biggest oil spill disaster that had ever happened in the United States. It was absolutely devastating to the ecology of this very pristine part of Alaska. And NPR, among other organizations, spent an enormous amount of time covering it. So that was my opportunity to do coverage for NPR and meet NPR people. And it resulted in my getting a residency at NPR. And so I got to Washington and I did the job and I thought, I could do this. You'll find this often. Now, these things that look rather imposing are often things when you get there, you find that the opportunities are good and the things are usually within your capacity.
Corey, take us just for a second inside the booth. We've all heard the thing. It's NPR from Washington, the Corey Flint, but what's going on? How do you get the news? How do you read it? What's the trick of doing this?
There's a little factory that in the heart of every news organization, and the factory at NPR is the newscast unit. And it's a matter of a desk that's constantly staffed by 4 or 5 people who are gathering news, recording news, putting things together. The newscasters actually write their newscasts, but usually it's based on consultations with your editors. You're constantly talking about what's coming up, what should you cover, what should you drop. We have reports from our various correspondents around the country and around the world, and those are coming in as pre-recorded pieces that you work into your newscast. So this whole thing comes together, and you work in a sort of cyclical world where you do a 5-minute newscast, and then you go back and you write for 45 minutes, and then you go and do the same thing over and over again. The reason I have such great name recognition is because for 17 years I had the opportunity to say my name 12 times a night.
And so somehow you went from NPR Central to Iraq with many steps, but there was one, I take it, helicopter ride that really brought you to the international scene with Condoleezza Rice.
Yes, I was substituting for a really wonderful correspondent on our foreign desk, Michelle Kelman, who's still there, and she's our State Department reporter. And while she was on maternity leave, I got to substitute for her. And one of the things that came up was a round-the-world trip with Condoleezza Rice. They do these periodically, and you hear reports from these trips. It's really difficult and energy-consuming because you spend your entire time either on the plane or in these various locations trying to put together a story at the last minute. And so we went to, as often happens on these trips, there was an unannounced trip to Iraq. And so we landed in Bahrain, and none of this was on the schedule because they don't like to be public about these trips until they've actually taken place. And so away we went. We got onto one of these C-130s, and we flew to Mosul. And as we were flying across Iraq, it's one of these big cargo planes, and they have a little flight deck up above, and Condoleezza Rice was alone on the flight deck, just with the pilots and the crew. And so I went up there, and we sat down, and we had this sort of awkward little conversation. And Condoleezza Rice looks out at the view that we're seeing, which is the Iraqi desert, just stretching for miles away. And a lot of it you couldn't see at all because there's always dust storms and there's always haze out there. She looks out and she says, "Isn't Iraq beautiful? I've been coming here for 4 or 5 times now, and I feel I really am getting to know this country, and I really have come to love it. And I thought, oh, that's pretty admirable. Wow. So, you know, we went on and we made chit-chat and this and that, and we landed in Mosul, and we found ourselves in a completely fortified American camp, surrounded by blast walls and tanks pointing outward. And then we went from there by helicopter to Baghdad, where we landed in a completely fortified American air base in Baghdad. And once again, we got into Humvees, you know, completely armored Humvees. We're wearing our, correspondents always look ridiculous in these things, because I was wearing a jacket and a tie, and I've got the bulletproof vest on, so I look like a penguin. And I've got the helmet that never quite fits right, never looks good like it does on the soldiers, you know. And so we're marching into this place under, you know, and I realized that this trip, which lasted for something like 10 hours, was what Condoleezza Rice meant when she said, well, I've been to Iraq 5 times and I feel I know it very well. She was completely shielded throughout these trips by American weaponry, and she met only people like generals and senior Iraqi politicians. So that was her idea of knowing and loving this country. I discovered afterwards that there's a lot more to it than that.
One of the things you did was embed with American troops. Tell us a little about that. That was a very different.
Yeah, the thing about embedding with American troops, that I learned, you know, NPR always had a household that was outside the green zone. I mean, we were well protected and we had good security, but we were never part of the green zone. So we did have a better access to Iraq. You know, we could go out in our cars and actually interview people, actually see the signs of sites of these bombings and that sort of thing. But periodically, we would also embed with the American military. And I discovered that there's a tremendous difference between riding around in NPR's armored car and riding around in a Humvee that's guarded by a Humvee crew of infantrymen. There's something about looking out the window of an armored vehicle that has a gunner on the roof that makes you instantly suspicious. I felt much less secure when I was traveling with American soldiers because the odds of being blown up were much greater. And I realized that, you know, to an American soldier looking through that bulletproof glass window, if you see, for instance, an Iraqi guy standing on the street corner talking on his cell phone, you're instantly afraid that he's either going to use that cell phone to detonate something or that he's calling in somebody else who's going to ambush you. You know, it's a very strange change that happens in your perception when you're in a situation like that. And so I understand why American troops are nervous and sometimes trigger happy in those situations. And it was the source of some of our biggest disasters in Iraq. The simple fact that you always feel that you're surrounded by enemy.
Many more fascinating experiences, but let's turn to the Russian.
Weren't we going to go to? Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, all right. So I know you spent 4 years in Russia, beginning in early 2012, arriving there when there were some of the largest demonstrations we've seen during the Putin period. So I just want to ask you a few questions about your experience there. So we should start with recent events. So we know in the last week there were, first of all, been again large protests against corruption, then followed a few days later by this horrible bombing in St. Petersburg. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you see as the significance of those events, in particular why you think protests have developed now after such a long period of quiescence.
It's funny, those protests were the bookends of my experience in Russia. When I first got there, it was in 2012, when there were a series of enormous protests in Moscow and St. Petersburg especially, that brought tens of thousands of people into the street. And those protests were precipitated by a feeling that the parliamentary elections that preceding fall had been blatantly stolen. And in fact, everything that you'll read about those protests, you'll see that United Russia officials, and United Russia is the party of President Putin, were absolutely scandalous in the way that they stole votes in that election. People were very much aware of it, and they were really angry about it. Secondly, there was the decision by then Prime Minister Putin and then President Dmitry Medvedev to change places. You know, so it became perfectly clear to everyone that Medvedev had been doing nothing but warming Putin's seat for him for 4 years, and that this was a plan that had always been put in place to get around the Russian term limits laws. So people were really angry, and they came out in these, you know, and it was interesting to see because these people were not radicals and they were not rabble. They were absolutely middle-class people, you know, who remember very well the Soviet Union and consider themselves to be much better off under the current regime than they were in the past. But they were people who were so angered by what they saw as the betrayals that were taking place that they went out on the street. Well, as soon as Putin was inaugurated, he began a campaign of extreme repression to silence opposition groups, shut down opposition media sources, and in general, make it really impossible to effectively protest against his regime. So for 4 years, we'd go and cover these very small demonstrations of, you know, a group of remaining loyalists who would get out there with their signs periodically, most of them older people. We saw fewer and fewer young people who were engaged by this. And it looked, at the time we were getting ready to leave, it looked as if the Kremlin had succeeded in completely repressing any kind of opposition feelings. Some friends of mine there who told me that, you know, a friend of mine had just gone to a commemorative march in honor of Boris Nemtsov. He'd been killed almost exactly 2 years before. 5,000 or 10,000 people came out. They marched up and down. She said to me, I feel like I've seen all these faces before, and the same old people who come out every time, and there are fewer and fewer young people engaged in this. Well, so 2 weeks ago, there's all of a sudden there are huge protests in downtown Moscow and more than 100 other cities. And those protests, if you look at the video from them, they are overwhelmingly made up of young people, you know, older teenagers and young adults, you know, who are being very peaceful but very passionate in this demonstration. And what got them going, once again, was a demonstration of corruption. Alexei Navalny, who is probably the most prominent remaining Russian opposition leader, he's an extreme nationalist, actually, but he is also a very charismatic and witty guy. And you can go on YouTube and see his most recent little documentary about Russian corruption. It's called Don't Call Him Demon. That's one of the nicknames for Dmitry Medvedev. It is a funny takedown of Medvedev's history of collecting assembling enormous wealth, including yachts and estates and palatial mansions around the country. And it's based on, the funny part of it is, it's based on his investigation was based on Medvedev's fancy sneakers. Medvedev has a reputation for being fascinated with technology, and he loves the net, and he loves to buy stuff on the net. And so Navalny traced how, you see a photograph of Medvedev wearing a nice sweater and a pair of really colorful sneakers. You know that he probably ordered them on the internet. And so he found an invoice that showed that these sneakers had been delivered to a friend of, a lifelong friend of Medvedev's. And then he found photographs that showed Medvedev wearing these garments, you know, very shortly after that. And from that, he then proceeded to network through the friend and the friend's business connections and the shell companies that the friend owns in Cyprus and in Bermuda and in London and so forth, and associated all those companies with various properties that Medvedev has been photographed at that are thought to be his properties. So it's totally worth watching, and it has English subtitles as well. So it's only about 10 or 11 minutes. So this was something that became an instant internet hit and got millions of hits. And it's thought that that's what finally drove people into the streets in absolute frustration, because the Russian economy is not doing well. Pensioners and people on fixed incomes are in terrible shape. Russian infrastructure is crumbling. And here we are, this guy is wearing his fancy sneakers on the deck of his fancy yacht, and we're supposed to swallow this? So I think that's what precipitated the protests. So we go on to the bombing in St. Petersburg. And as you know, Russia is no stranger to these kinds of attacks. We've had terrorists open up with gunfire in the airport in Moscow. We've had people attack the metros in Moscow and other places. So my feeling is that this could have been anything. It seems that this might have been a lone wolf, Al-Qaeda influenced kind of attack by a guy from Central Asia, Kyrgyzstan, who may have been disaffected in some way, we don't know. So, when you become a Russia watcher, there are three possibilities that open up to you when something like this happens. A, this is a random act committed by a random terrorist, such as we have in the United States. But the Russian government is going to seize hold of this as an opportunity and use it as a chance to enact further repression especially against the kind of people who took part in these protests just a week before. The second, which is the conspiracy theory, is that the Russian government itself actually committed this act as a provocation, which could then be used as a device and an excuse for more repression. And the third is that that this is something that is actually an Al-Qaeda or Taliban-connected act that was actually run from abroad. So, the discouraging thing for a journalist is that it's very hard to figure out what's what.
Okay, so we were talking earlier, and you talked about loving Moscow, the beautiful public parks being renovated, the society, but at the same time viewing the regime as a very corrupt kind of mafia regime. And I think many other people have had that reaction, that this is a well-educated society of wonderful people that are really badly governed. So could you just talk a little bit about that duality, that contradiction?
Yes, throughout Vladimir Putin's tenure, which began in 2000, so he's been in office for 17 years, Russia enjoyed, tremendous good fortune. Oil prices were high. Russia is almost entirely a resource extractive economy. Putin's fault probably is that his government has never tried to diversify that economy and protect it, so that when oil prices collapsed, suddenly Russia's revenues had fallen by approximately 50%. The Russian government, incidentally, can still make money when oil goes down to as low as $30 a barrel, but it wreaks hell with the Russian budget. And so that's the situation that they're in now. And they had further difficulty as a result of the US and European sanctions that were brought after the seizure of Crimea. I think that those sanctions were not as serious a part of Russia's difficulties as the drop in oil prices. So overall revenue collapse was what hit them the hardest. But in the meantime, though, up until this happened, Putin and his regime were able to show great results for the Russian economy. If you go to Moscow, it is in almost every respect, at least in central Moscow, it is a modern, almost European city. If you go to St. Petersburg, it is a European city, and you find nice cafes, nice lively theaters, and an interesting art scene, and beautiful public parks. So people, and it's borne out by economic statistics too. I mean, people's wealth grew during that time. people's incomes grew, people's spending power grew. And so Russians, by and large, were pretty satisfied. And the trade-off was that, yes, this is a mafia state in many ways. Yes, most of the wealth is siphoned off by Russian oligarchs and members of the security services. But in fact, the share that was given to the ordinary Russian consumer was so much better than what they had under Soviet times that it felt like progress. And I think that that's why Russians are still very loyal to this government, even though they know pretty much what's going on.
Okay, so I think that most of the people in the audience, most of the people in the United States who follow the news, one of their dominant understandings or impressions of Russian behavior over the last several years is that it's become quite aggressive. First there was invasion of Georgia, then of Ukraine, the taking of Crimea, the intervention in Syria, the menacing of the Baltic states. And I just wanted to, in the Soviet, the Russian government would say that much of this behavior is actually defensive, that NATO was surrounding them, that they were determined to set limits on NATO's expansion. Others would see this as really an aggressive behavior that's designed to simply strengthen the Russian state and project power. I just wonder if you could talk about how you see the motives of the Russian government in this foreign policy.
I think it's a little bit of both. You know, I think that Putin genuinely believes that he is under threat, and he believes that the United States is the source of that threat. And he sees, you know, and he has said repeatedly that the West has continually tried to undermine Russia ever since the fall of the Soviet Union. You know, he's also the guy who said that the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the last century.
Yes, he did.
You know, what happened to World War II? You know, but you know, so I think these are articles of faith for him. Remember that he is a lieutenant colonel in the KGB, and that most of his education came through the KGB, and he does tend to see the United States as an enemy. What's more, you know, he saw the expansion of NATO right up to Russia's borders as something that was deliberately designed to hem in Russia. I believe that his, you know, I mean, look at the Baltic states that share direct borders with Russia. They could not wait to become part of NATO because they were always afraid of Russian aggression. The same was true of Ukraine. Ukraine would have liked to have joined NATO. Georgia would have liked to have joined NATO. You can make a case for the fact that the Russian aggression against places like Georgia was designed to make it impossible for them to join NATO because NATO can't accept a member that's involved in a current conflict or war. You know, so once Georgia had been engaged, then there was no way that they could be accepted as members of NATO. Same is true of Ukraine. So, you know, there are lots of arguments on either side, but, you know, if you live in Moscow long enough, it's a bit like looking through the window of that Humvee. Everybody outside of it looks like an enemy to you. And everything that's done is not a friendly gesture anymore, but part of a conspiracy against you. You know, so they, you know, remember that they saw, I believe truly that he sees Hillary Clinton as a potential enormous enemy and as the person who helped to foment those opposition demonstrations back in 2011, 2012. He sees, you know, the fact that the United States has indeed spent a great deal of money in Russia and Eastern Europe for democracy building programs, for election monitoring programs, for independent press. He sees that as subversion, you know, absolute naked subversion, very much as we see the accusation that Russia has hacked American elections. You know, so it's a question of which side of that armored window you're on.
Okay, and one final question. So you raised already the issue of Hillary Clinton, but I still wonder whether the Russian government or most of the Russian political and security elite would really wanted to hurt Clinton, that they really preferred Trump, a complete unknown, somebody about whose foreign policy they knew nothing, whose behavior was unpredictable. Do you think that the Russian government was really determined to damage the electoral prospects of Hillary Clinton?
They certainly despised Hillary. Now, whether that meant that they could work with her was another thing. I talked to analysts in Moscow who said, yeah, we know what she's all about, and although we may not be able to work with her, we can do deals. We can work on nuclear proliferation, which is important to both sides. We can work on maintaining a degree of military cooperation so we don't collide with each other and inadvertently start a war. There are many reasons for us to want to keep engaging Russia. And they thought, well, at least Hillary, they know what kind of diplomacy she does, and they've dealt with her a lot. So there was a certain amount of stability in that. On the other hand, people told me that there are two potential wins for Russia if Donald Trump were elected. One is that he may, in fact, be friendly enough towards Russia, and he may, in fact, not care enough about the foreign policy implications of Ukraine, for instance, that he may be willing to drop sanctions. And if the United States dropped sanctions, Russia would soon follow after. And that would be a tremendous win for the Kremlin. The second would be that if Donald Trump created an atmosphere of chaos and turmoil in the United States, it would take away American attention from foreign policy altogether, and thus give Russia a much freer hand to operate geopolitically. So there are two potential wins. On the other hand, they did understand that the unpredictability could come back to bite them in the backside.
And one might say bite us as well.
Yes.
We're about to turn to Corey's future, but as soon as we do, we'll open it up to questions. So there are two microphones. So please, if you want to ask a question, open it up to you all. Anything goes. Please just head for a microphone. But before we do that, let's talk about the future.
Yeah, and obviously there's much more to discuss about Putin, Trump, and Russia, and we're hoping that questions will, follow suit about that. But we are curious. You seem to be making a move after a very illustrious career to going back to fiction writing, the initial youthful aspiration. Can you talk more about what's next?
Yes, I am. I have a novel on the boards. What I want to do is take my experience as a foreign correspondent and apply it to fiction. There's so much that you have to be careful about even when you're talking about things that you've reported in the past. And I would like to simply apply the things I learned in Iraq, for instance, about what militaries are like and what happens when military adventures go wrong. Or the things that I learned in India, for instance, about what happens when economies collapse or rise or fall, and what happens when cultures are disrupted and that sort of thing. And so why not do it as fiction, where you can combine all these things into a single narrative, So that's what's up for me. And the other thing is I still like talking about Russian foreign policy, so I'll keep doing that.
Cool. All right. So watch for local bookstores in a year or so. Let's go to the first question. And of course, as always, keep them short, no autobiographies. Here you go.
Good evening. I'd love to hear 3 or 4 or 5 aspects from your perspective that Putin and Trump are very similar, but also very dissimilar.
Good question.
That is a good question. We have to remember that what we know about Putin is something that's evolved. He has evolved as a leader over a 17-year period. He came in as an almost complete unknown. He made some sort of clumsy foreign policy gaffes early in his career, but he has become steadily more knowledgeable and more poised as time has gone on. And, I've seen him in this kind of forum. I've seen him sitting in an armchair at various conferences and so forth many times. And I'm here to tell you that this is a charismatic guy. This is a guy who projects enormous authority. He's a comparatively small man. He's about 5'6" or so. When you see him standing among his entourage, he's always the smallest person in the group. but he's a guy who fills up a lot of space. You notice if you ever see him in one of these things, he sits like this. He man spreads. He puts his arm around it like this. He owns the stage. So he's now a guy who's learned a great deal from his 17 years in power. He has also steadily consolidated his own position. So in 2012, as you may recall, there was a lot of interest in who ran the Kremlin, who were the centers of power in the Kremlin. And in fact, you may remember the New York Times would do these graphics. It would show photographs, little circular photographs of the Russian leadership. And, part of them were the security service people, some of them were the liberal economists, and there were lines drawn back and forth, and it was all very impressive, and we all paid a lot of attention to it. Well, nobody's doing that anymore, and the reason for that is that Putin has little by little gotten rid of a lot of his former cronies, and he's replaced them with young technocrats who've never known anything but Putin in power and have no loyalties anywhere else. So he has become a vastly more powerful figure over that time. So we have this guy who's crafty, who's a quick study, who's personally charismatic, and who has a great deal of experience in power, and who has become the pencil point of Russian policy on every single subject. Then we have Mr. Trump, whose career we have all followed for a long time, especially in this neck of the woods. But I mean, his career is that of a businessman, a marketer, a branding guy, a guy who was able to make a name that he was then able to sell, a guy who's always prided himself on being able to do deals. And, he has not had the policy experience, nor does he seem to have the policy interest that could make him into the kind of force that Putin has made himself into. So I think we're in dangerous territory, and I would like to see more institutional support for a coherent American foreign policy, which would include using the resources of our State Department, using the resources of the Pentagon, and not concentrating power among a coterie of people who have very little experience.
Vladimir.
Yeah, hi, I'm Vladimir. I'm an undergraduate, and I had a question about Alexei Navalny. I know that in Russia, opposition leaders have a habit of being jailed on charges of corruption or whatever it might be. Navalny, however, in the European Court of Justice was found to be not guilty. I'm wondering, is Navalny getting to be too big to jail? Is he too famous? What do you think is going to be the future of Navalny going forward towards the 2018 presidential elections?
Well, as you probably know, Navalny has been tried and convicted on what are universally, I mean, at least what, for instance, the European Court of Justice regarded as trumped-up charges, and what they actually called a ludicrous judicial process. But nevertheless, he has been convicted, and one of the things that means is that he can't legally run for president of Russia, and he is the leading potential opposition candidate. The other thing is that in one of these trials, he was tried along with his brother for having allegedly committed embezzlement in a business deal that they were involved in. His brother was thrown into jail. And so in a way, there's a hostage to the government, to the justice system, this brother in jail. Navalny has effectively been blocked from running for political office. His brother is being held essentially as a hostage. The Russian government, up until now, has always wanted to show that there was an opposition, whether it was viable or not. They wanted to show that there was an opposition, and that it is possible to do that. There are, in fact, systemic opposition political parties in the Duma right now that are part of the Kremlin system and will always vote the Kremlin line. But there is, one of the things about Russia's democracy is that it has always tried to preserve some sort of trapping of opposition. And I think Navalny is their guy, and the reason that he's allowed to go free, at least so far, is that, he is still the symbol that somehow we have some sort of open process in Russia. That may prove not to be true in the future, and Navalny has always had to live with the possibility that he could be jailed at any time. Like so many people who are about to be arrested in Russia, he does keep a bag, of toiletries and things like that, ready to go.
Do you view Putin's ultimate vision for Russia as being something relatively modest, basic economic prosperity, the lifting of sanctions, prestige and respect in the international arena? Or on the other hand, do you think it's rather more ambitious than that, in a sense, becoming the nation, a hegemon, as it were, on par with, say, the current United States or previous empires?
That was well put, and I think that in fact his vision is bigger than that. I think he's looking for the restoration of the Soviet and the Russian imperial empire. He'd like all that territory to be Russian. He believes that it is Russian. He said many times that the neighboring countries are not countries at all. He said this of the Baltic states. He said this of Ukraine. And he said it of Kazakhstan, as a matter of fact. So these are all former Soviet countries that he regards as being essentially part of Russia's orbit, at the very least, if not part of Russia's imperial territory. So there is that. The other thing is restoration of the economy, and I think there's a certain amount of magical thinking that goes on in the Kremlin. The idea that if sanctions were dismissed and oil prices rose even slightly, they could be back in a position where they could sort of restore their economy, build up their foreign reserves, and then start attracting foreign investment again. So there is that as well. But, I think it's a mentality. Putin has a mentality that you don't want to back into a corner unless you're willing to take really decisive action against him.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm an undergraduate at Brown as well. We've seen over the past few years an expansion of Russia's aggression, as you said. We're seeing this particularly in the cyber arena. We're seeing this in cyber incursions in Georgia. We're seeing it in the allegations of interference in election processes. And we also see it in investment in Russia's cyber apparatus as a form of conflict. Where do you see this growing, and who do you think could be the possible next target of Putin's cyber arm?
Well, I certainly think that, and I'm just taking the word of the United States intelligence agencies, that they expect that, they see that the Russians as having experienced success, maybe far beyond their original plans, in fact. My guess is that the sort of Russian cyber attacks on the United States may have been a lot more modest in scope, or at least modest in ambition, and that they may have had a sort of windfall success that they didn't fully expect. So people from the intelligence agencies are saying, building on that success, we can expect to see more and probably more sophisticated cyber attacks. And it's not just a question of propaganda or hacking or trying to influence the political process. There's, in my mind, far greater dangers to our infrastructure. There was a Russian exploit last year. It shut down a power plant in Western Ukraine. They've shown that they have that ability. So I think that we can consider ourselves a target and that we should take defensive action.
Thank you.
Interesting question. Professor Head.
So it's not hard to see that President Trump is close to a certified sociopath. So how do you see President Putin taking advantage of that in the past and in the future? I read an article in Vanity Fair last night about one of always confuse those two, sorry about that. Putin's closest advisors who had written a story and a pseudonym about the ways in which they manipulated the Ukraine, et cetera, through false information and everything like that. So the question is really, how do you see the future in terms of the tendencies of our current U.S. president and the capabilities of the FSB and their agenda?
You know, it seems to me that, you know, the Trump administration is now besieged by these various accusations and connections and so forth, and they seem to have drawn in their horns quite a bit as far as activities with Russia. And that may happen for the foreseeable future. What's more, the Russian attitude towards Trump seems to have changed. You know, they were absolutely gleeful when Trump was elected, and you know, we know that there were communications among Kremlin officials patting themselves on the back for having achieved, not for having achieved, but for having predicted or having said that this was a possibility when most people in the West didn't believe it was true. I think that, you know, if I'm going to sit here and do something that I could never do when I was a reporter, and that's speculate about what's going to happen.
That's what we do here.
Yeah, the various
Try to
arenas.
avoid it.
You know, I think in the arena of Ukraine, for instance, I think that we're aiming at we'll find ourselves in a frozen conflict, not unlike what we have in Georgia, Abkhazia, for instance, right now. I don't think that Putin domestically can afford to withdraw from eastern Ukraine. He certainly can't politically. It would be political suicide for him to give up Crimea. And I think that we're going to find that there's not enough interest on the part of the United States or the West to defend Ukraine's interests, unfortunately. I mean, that's something that we really should have given a lot more support and a lot more attention to Ukraine. But that's not in the cards right now. So I think what we're going to find ourselves with is one of these awful frozen conflicts. Costly to the United States, costly to Ukraine, and it's going to make it very difficult for Ukraine to achieve its ideal or its ambition of joining the European Union anytime soon. I think the same thing is going to happen in Syria. I think that Russia has invested a great deal of prestige in supporting Bashar al-Assad. I think they're going to continue to do that. You know, they've shown that they're willing to commit war crimes to support al-Assad. And, you know, I think that's something that, you know, what they've had is, you know, the old Colin Powell Pottery Barn rule that if you break it, it's yours. You break it, you buy it. They have become invested in it, and Syria is now Russia's problem in a way that it was not America's problem. And that means that he's going to have to continue to invest time and resources in Syria, and he's going to probably have to force a situation where Assad claims most of Western Syria, the mountain regions, the Alawite regions, and is going to have to leave a sort of frozen conflict line between the eastern parts of the city, of the country. That will be the responsibility of the various neighbor countries that are involved in this. One of the things that I've noticed about Syria lately is that Russia seems to be getting militarily exhausted there. You recall that, you know, when Assad's armies seized the city of Palmyra, you know, that was a great coup and something that was widely celebrated in Russia. You know, they were tremendously proud of the fact that it was with Russian support that Assad was able to reclaim that sort of iconic city. Well, there was very little publicity when later on it fell back into the hands of ISIS. And it's only very recently that they were able to recover it again. That says to me that Russia doesn't have the military force, it may have the military force to capture ground, doesn't have the military force to hold it. You know, that's a very exhausting, very personnel intensive business, as we found in Iraq. You know, so I think that Putin is in the same shape that we were and are in Iraq.
Interesting.
Speaking of, so to speak, frozen conflicts, over the last several decades, as climate change has affected conditions in the Arctic, we've seen more and more kind of pushing of buttons in the region, especially on the Russian front, kind of claiming territory and sending expeditions under the ice and above. I suppose I was interested in hearing your perspective, like, do you think as sea ice continues to recede in the coming years, is there a political will in Russia to kind of see how far they can go and kind of push their luck into the Arctic? And do you think that, perhaps with your perspective from Alaska, like, do you think the United States will have the will or the capability to kind of push back and prevent Russia from having somewhat of a free hand in the Arctic?
No, I think there is the political will in Russia. And I think, that they certainly would like to dominate the Arctic with as much territory as they can possibly claim. And as you said, I mean, that goes right up to the North Pole where they dropped that titanium Russian flag. There's also a great deal of capacity in Russia that other Arctic nations do not have. They have the best fleet of icebreakers, including nuclear-powered icebreakers, and they have an enormous amount of engineering expertise when it comes to working in the Arctic. So they are a formidable player in the Arctic right now. But at the same time, I think that right now at least, the open water passage through northern Russia it's premature to say that there really is a lot to be done there, because in fact, even at the best, that passage is only open for a very short window in the summertime. The weather there is terrible. So that if you're planning to take one of those big cruise ships through the Russian Arctic passage, bring your slicker. I mean, it could be potentially pretty awful. And what's more, if you're in a vessel in the Arctic and you get caught in one of these terrible storms, you get frozen in, like the Franklin expedition, there's nobody's going to be able to come and rescue you either. So the environmental challenges are really formidable. Russia's, big interest in the Arctic, of course, is in resource extraction. And, at the very beginning, at least, it's all about offshore oil. But with oil prices dropping to the level that they have, with fracking being, such a big deal in the United States, with nations like Iran bringing more and more oil production online, I don't think Arctic oil development is going to be a very serious issue for anybody in the immediate future anyway. Canada is the country that probably has the most to lose in terms of territory in the Arctic. The United States has rather less, but I mean we have a resources to protect on the North Slope and that kind of thing. So I think we need to get in there, and we need to have a presence in the Arctic, and we need to be doing research there, for sure.
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead.
Hey, thank you so much for being here today. I was going to ask about Syria, and you kind of beat me to the punch a little bit. But as a follow-up, do you think the situation, Russia's situation in Syria, is going to change at all as a result of the chemical weapons use that happened recently and the increased calls for actions in the United States that followed?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I fully understand your question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no,
are a little bad.
My bad. I'm sorry. Do you think Russia's position in Syria is going to change at all as a result of the chemical weapons use that happened earlier this week?
No. No. I mean, because Russia has always denied that those attacks came from the Syrian government. Recently, in the UN recently, we saw them trying to blame the rebels. The rebels somehow have stores of sarin gas that we didn't know about, and that they, for some reason, never used before. And I think that's a crock. I think that whole that whole Russian story built around rebels having gas is absolutely untrue. I think it's propaganda. I think it was the Syrian government that did that. But Putin has shown that he will support Assad through any atrocity or any war crime that the man can think of doing. The Russians are the ones who have bombed hospitals in Syria. unfortunately, they have a whataboutism case where we bombed a hospital as well. But you know, I think that the strategy on the part of the Assad government and on the part of Russia is to attack these civilian centers, drive people out of them, take them over if it means leveling cities like Aleppo, and you know, assuring that Assad stays in control. You know, so I don't think that a little thing like 200 people being killed by chemical weapons is going to deter anybody in Russia.
Thank you.
Corey, this has been fascinating. Just one last question. There's a lot of students here who aspire to a life like yours, to a life of journalism, a life of writing. So to get back to John's questions, any advice?
Yeah, you know, the only thing about my career is I wish I had started it sooner. You know, I wish I didn't start it in college. You know, I mean, I basically did. After I left grad school, I did start to write for a little free paper in Chicago called the Chicago Reader.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and so that was was dipping my toes into it at that point. You know, but I'm really sorry that I missed the years immediately after college when I could have been doing reporting somewhere, you know, and having a lot of fun doing it, you know, and had less at stake than I did later on in my career where I felt like I had to succeed.
All right, get to work, everybody. Corey, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.